So this is what we're making, a ring shank casting with cuttlefish. Well, it's summer, and I'm lucky enough to live close to a beach where we get the cuttlefish backbone. When you get these, make sure that they're not cracked. Just give them a gentle tweak. If they're cracked, when you start casting or when you start trying to make your pattern, it'll break and it's really frustrating. Now, ideally, these would be big enough that we could just cut it in half, flatten it, and use the two pieces. Usually, we get pieces that are fairly small, so you'd end up using two pieces. Make sure they're dry. What I'm going to do is just a simple casting, and it's so that I use cuttlefish so that I can get the pattern of the cuttlefish. So the first thing we're going to do is saw this end off, and then we're going to saw this layer off and make it flat. I would suggest you work over a trash can. This is really messy, so we'll just see how we go. Your jeweler saw works really good for cutting this. I'm just going to cut across and so we want a nice flat bit here, and then we're just going to watch our fingers. And a nice flat bit here. Now you could take a piece of like 80 grit sandpaper and put it on your bench to flatten this, or I'm just going to step outside and rub it on the cement. You can see this is nice and flat now, and we're going to, at this point, saw a sprue in so that we can pour our metal down in there. Now, I'm going to make a ring shank, and I just have to decide how wide and how deep I want it. But you have to be careful with this because it's really easy to make it too thick. So don't make it more than 1 millimeter deep. Now I know the ring shank that I want needs to be 60 millimeters long. So I'm just going to mark that. And I've got a square-ended punch that I'm just going to drag down there, and we want to make sure that there's a flat bit at the bottom, because if there isn't, what will happen is the metal will just flow right out. So just look at the side and make sure that you have the same depth all the way along. Now, I want an aggressive pattern, so what I'm going to do is take a stiff brush and brush out this, so you can see, if I hold it right, that there are fairly aggressive marks, and that's what we want. That's the reason we use cuttlefish. In the old days, they used to use cuttlefish because it made a good impression, and you could do three-dimensional casting without a lot of fuss and bother. But we're just going to do a simple one. Now, ideally, you'd have a second piece of cuttlefish to go on the other side. But what I'm going to do is just use a new flat piece of charcoal and I'm just going to use masking tape to hold it on. It doesn't need to be wired or anything. So just make sure that it's nice and flat up against the charcoal, otherwise the metal will run out the side. So we can just rub it. Yeah, pretty good. Now, before we put that on there, what we have to do is figure out how much metal we need for this. And this is really simple for this particular version because this is a rectangle, and you just multiply the length times the width times the height, 3 dimensions, width, thickness, and height. In millimeters, when you get your answer, shift the decimal point 3 to the left. That'll give you cubic centimeters. Multiply that by 10.4, and that'll tell you how much metal, sterling silver, you need for this casting. And then add another 10 grams up here for the sprue button. So I'm going to measure this, do the math, and then we'll be ready to cast. Now my math says I need 5.2 grams for this, so I'm going to add an extra 5 grams for here. You can see where I've rubbed this against my charcoal block. Nice and gray. And that means I'll have a good connection. Now, before we put that on there, what we'll do is just drag a sharp object from the bottom up on an angle to the outside from either side. So this is just an air vent. Yeah? Doesn't have to be very big. And now we're ready to tape this together. So just make sure this is flush with the top. Doesn't have to be killer tight, but it needs to be snug. And on the bottom. And now what I'm going to do is just balance this upright in my pumice pan. Big torch. If you have a mini torch, you can just buy a used one of these for roughly $100, complete with the hoses, and it hooks right to your regulators. So do it if you can. And it's the same gas and it's the same flame, it's just bigger. So once again, make sure it's nice and liquid. And we'll just pour it right through the flame. And then let it cool. Well, this definitely looks better. There's less of a button there. And there you go. There's our cuttlefish ring shank. Now, you just trim this off like you would any other silver, but be fairly gentle with it because you want to keep the pattern. One of the things that's bad about this type casting is that this is calcium. So it smells like burning bone. And the first time I cast this, I did it in my house, and it really upset the cat, and it set off the smoke alarm. So don't, if you're working in your house, don't do this. It's really smelly. So here's the piece that I've cut out of that length. Fairly nice pattern. It's a bit blobby on the end where I did the first one. Now, when you're forming this, you'll probably have to keep annealing it. This is a little bit thicker than I wanted, and it is a casting and it will crack, but just keep annealing. Tap it fairly gently with your rawhide hammer and you should be good. So there it is, and you can see why I like it, because it even has the pattern on the side. Yeah, I just did a quick polish on the wheel with this. Normally I would tumble it, but this pattern is aggressive enough you could polish it on the wheel.